if we are involved in the center links of the chain, what they call the golden chain of salvation, all right, I can't, I know this is a distraction, but I can't resist. You know, Susan talked in the 2013 conference about, you know, Calvinisms and Reformed theology in general, the connection to Gnosticism and Platonism. And so we have in Calvinism what they call the golden chain of salvation. All right. The philosophers had what they called the golden chain of philosophers. I can't help but to think the term was borrowed, but I digress. If we are involved in the center links of justification, sanctification becomes a spiritual minefield that could keep us from finishing the race of salvation. Does that make sense? Is there any questions on that between those two charts there? This installs the Reformed elder in a strategic position that is critical to our salvation, viz. Calvin's powers of the keys doctrine. I'm introducing another angle on this. Calvin believed that sins committed in the Christian life separate us from grace. Well, right, because you need to be, resaved, right? So obviously, new sins that we commit in the Christian life. And I've even had Reformed people debate me on my blog and say this. You know, you say that justification is a finished work. Well, what about the new sins that we commit in our Christian life? Okay? Well, what sins? We're no longer under the law. And Paul said, where there is no law, there is no sin. See, this is what they miss. But forgiveness that reinstates justification can be found by elder absolution within the institutional church. Hence, faithfulness to the institutional church greatly enhances your chances to, quote, stand in the judgment. The reference is there. Calvin said this in no uncertain terms, and it's absolutely no different than Catholic absolution. That's the problem. A linear gospel is salvation by works, a salvation by works gospel, even if Calvinists have come up with a formula that redefines certain works as faith alone. Furthermore, as with all works salvation gospel, an additional mediator is tossed in other than Christ. This is part and parcel with works gospels, okay? Works soteriology. Unless salvation is a finished work, totally separate from sanctification, the Christian must live in fear of the coming judgment. And that is exactly what Calvin and Luther prescribed. Calvin taught that the Christian life must be attended with, quote, grief of soul and terror in regard to the coming judgment. Citation there. Clearly, the Apostle John and the Hebrew writer refuted the idea that fear of judgment has any place in the life of the Christian. This is a direct contradiction to that. This becomes the focus and not the utilization of gifts granted to the believer in service to the master. Christ addresses this very approach to salvation in the parable of the talents. A right perspective on justification leads to aggressive obedience and sanctification because justification is a settled issue. What am I saying here? Aggressive sanctification, aggressive obedience and sanctification reveals what we really believe about justification. All right? Clearly, in Calvinism, the focus has to be, unless you're nuts, the focus must be being prepared to stand in the judgment. Okay? Calvinism is nothing new. One can see its like tenets being addressed throughout the New Testament as false. For example, the issue of faith without works that we perform in James 2:14 following. Calvinism virtually upsets every element of biblical truth and redefines the new birth as mortification, vivification. Obedience is new obedience. Repentance is deep repentance. The finished work of salvation is progressive and makes no distinction between repentance as a son versus that of the unregenerate to be saved. Therefore, its life application will not glorify God in any way, shape, or form. Okay? Any questions? No questions at all. That could be good and that could be bad. If you would turn off the stream